Good afternoon. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to talk about an issue that's really important to us that you've all probably seen us talk about. Maybe you joined our town hall, but we're here to give you an intro into our issue around teacher equity. Heather, how are you doing today?
And well, it's so sunny and summery today.
Yeah, this is going to be a hot weekend. I'm very, very excited about it, but also just super excited to talk about this issue that we've actually been tracking as a coalition for a long time, and we're ready and excited to talk to you all about it and hear your thoughts and hear what you think the solutions are. So let's get into it. So as you all might have seen from a couple different graphics, our petition, our town hall over the last several months, we have been focusing on the inequitable distribution of teachers across Minneapolis public schools and how students of color don't have access to the teachers that they need in order to get the results that we want to see. It's a really deep value, I think, to us as a coalition, and I think to us as a society, to understand that teachers are our most important resource in our classrooms, and they're the biggest factor. The quality of a teacher is the biggest factor in student learning, and it really makes a difference. And so when we see some of the outrageous opportunity gaps, resource gaps, we can really look at how are our teachers distributed and what are the quality of our teachers across our system and their ability to meet student needs. And so this is actually, while this has been an issue that we've sent letters to the district board members. We've been, having petitions, doing graphics, different things like that to help people understand. We thought it'd be important to do a video, and also important to point out, this isn't something that we just started. Actually, in the process of the CDD, we asked the district to really look at how are you distributing teachers, because they put out their own presentation saying, hey, we know that we aren't doing this well. We know that students of color are having access to teachers smaller candidate pools of teachers, more inexperienced teachers, more placed teachers, right? And this is a problem. And so we've been very, very consistent on this issue, and for several years now. And so, Heather, I just wanted to kick it to you to see what else did you have to add about our issue and what's important to know.
I think the thing that we really need to understand is that the racist patterns that are embedded in the redlining of our city and the air quality of our city and the housing opportunities in our city, those patterns also flow through the teacher movement in our city. That as teachers gain experience and ability and mobility, they tend to move toward whiteness and privilege and Southwest. So it is a pattern that only exasperates the racism that our city is embedded in. It's in the air we breathe, it's in the food we eat, right?
Yep.
It's in the schools we walk into. And so this pattern is no different. We just want to highlight that. It's a very predictable, and we think that all racist patterns, the disruption of it is necessary, even though it can feel uncomfortable, messy, challenging, all of the things.
Right. And we know that every school community is different, especially in Minneapolis, which is so diverse and has so many different areas and regions within it that have totally different personalities. And so what we think is really important is how do we disrupt this system in a way that centers student needs in a much more significant way? And how do we make sure that we are supporting schools, communities to be able to have access and choose the teachers that they know will best meet their needs? And so I think that's a really, really important thing to understand about what our campaign has been all about. How do we ensure that, some of the things that Heather just described aren't predictable along racial lines? How do we ensure that experience isn't predictable along racial lines? How do we ensure that teachers of color aren't being let go from our system in a predictable way along racial lines, right? These are the things that we see consistently that are producing really poor results for our students of color and our Indigenous students. And so, we think it's really important that we have an understanding that this system is not the way that we are controlling teacher movement, the way that teacher movement is dictated right now is not tenable if we're really serious about trying to disrupt and close our achievement and opportunity gaps, because we're not actually utilizing our most important resource in the ways that we need. And this isn't just something that is like, AEC cares about today, and like that's why the district, the board, union should all move on this issue. This is actually codified into law, right? Like we know that the world's best workforce legislation at the state level says that like they need to, that we need to ensure that students of color have equitable access to teachers. We know that our elementary and secondary school education law also says that this is a priority and that districts need to make this happen. And that also in MPS policy, we have our equity and diversity policy that says we need to equitably distribute resources, even if that means not everyone gets the same resources. How do we equitably distribute resources? And again, if teachers are our most important resource, how are we thinking about managing their movement and where they are? And so these are all codified into policies and laws, both all the way from the local level to the national level.
And we are out of compliance.
We're out of compliance on, and that we've presented on in a public board meeting, all the way back to September of 2019. We presented on this data. And when I say we, I mean Minneapolis Public Schools presented on this data to the public saying like, this is what we're doing. And we haven't heard anything, not a single thing since then about this issue, which is so problematic. And so that's what this campaign is about. That's what this issue is driving towards, is like, how do we create real change? How do we ensure that our school communities are ensuring that we have the teachers, that they have the teachers to meet the needs of their students? And so, like I said, we've been going about this issue in a really intentional way now for the last 6 or 7 months. And so we've heard some feedback, we've heard some critiques of our campaign that we want to address because we think they're real and they're important and we want to talk about them. And so I want to kick it to Heather, who's heard them and internalized them in ways that are so important to making sure that our work is intentional and smart and realizes the goals that we need to realize.
Yeah, so like I think the number one place where we hear is like experience doesn't necessarily make a good teacher. We hear this from community members often, right? Experience, years of experience does not exactly equal a good teacher. And so, yes, that's true. You can have a first-year teacher knock it out of the park, and you can have a teacher so close to retirement that we've all had both of those teachers, right? And so we know that. But the problem with experience in our district is that it is the thing that drives the teacher movement. So for us not to talk about experience when it's literally the public data that we use to make the majority of our decisions, to give job security, to give tenure, to give pay scale raise. That is what our system is based on, is that experience. So we don't necessarily agree that experience makes a good teacher. We would love to talk about all of the other ways that our district could help us as a public community define a good teacher. But what the data shows, right, is that the more experience a teacher gains, the quicker and the fluency happens where they had to white and or privileged schools. That's what our own data shows. So it's impossible to not talk about it.
Yeah, I think using experience. I think what we've heard as a criticism is that people see us using experience as a proxy for quality or effectiveness, and I think experience does have an impact on teacher quality, but it's not a replacement for if a teacher's experience, that means a teacher is high quality. What Heather pointed out is important though, because what this experience data shows us is the longer that somebody's in Minneapolis public schools, they are moving their way towards whiteness and wealth. And I think that is important to be able to map that our teacher movement system right now in Minneapolis public schools is operating in this way that, again, is predictable along so many other racial lines and is predictable along so many other issues, in our community where we see this movement towards whiteness and wealth. And so that's why experience data is so important to understand and recognize, is that we see this pattern that has to be disrupted, that has to be dismantled if we're going to have a real conversation about making sure that students of color and schools that are serving communities of color are getting the teachers that they need in order to meet the goals that they want to meet.
Yeah, and then the other thing that people, I don't know if people really understand this, that when you get a school budget, each school is charged what they call like an average teacher salary, which, right? So the average teacher salary is somewhere right around $100,000. Teachers can make well above that or well below that. But what we know is that if we pay for experience, and if experience travels to Southwest, and that schools are being charged the actual cost, what that means is that Northside or global majority schools that have that higher average of lower experienced teachers are financially subsidizing the experienced teachers in Southwest schools. And there are many, many ways that money flows to Southwest, right? Like directly away from North and Northeast. And so that's another byproduct of this set of policies that we have to name. Like, it's happening.
Yeah. And I think, when again, we're talking about this teacher movement, we also then, like you said, have to talk about this resource movement and having, our predominantly Black and brown schools subsidizing our white and wealthy schools serving white and wealthy communities. Like, that's really problematic. And I think, coming back to our issue and coming back to our concern is that when we're talking about experience in this way, right, we have to recognize that if this is the pattern of teacher movement, we aren't meeting the needs of students, right? And what we need to do is we need to figure out, how do we disrupt this pattern? And there's lots of different ways that can happen, right? Can we incentivize teachers to go in a different direction? What we're really trying to do when we talk about incentivizing is you're asking them to provide incentives that reverses years and years and years of historical racist patterns. So I think the incentives are going to have to be pretty big, whether that's workplace conditions or whatever, or pay or whatever, right? But I think what's difficult is, like, these patterns aren't serving students. And so right now we have a system that's predicated around teacher choice and not around student need, right? And so how do we create a better balance around ensuring that, teachers want to be in the places that they teach, right? We don't want a teacher to be resistant to a place where they are, right? And at the same time, like, how do we ensure that it's actually centered around student need and what the school community needs? And so that's where our concern really lies. So
I have one last point about that. I do think, when we think about that, we have to also think about the small amount of students of color that are in those predominantly white schools, which, by the way, those are racially isolated schools as well. We just don't count them in the way that we value whiteness over students of color. But there was the TikTok that came out just, I think, last week, right? The Black student sharing the experience that she had in a predominantly white, very wealthy, very privileged school, where she was told, you are not acting as smart as white students right now. And so I think that, like, we have to really think about the students of color everywhere in our city, right? Too, and, like, really think about that. Like, what does it do to just have a certain group of teachers and that mindset all clustered in one part of the city? How is that for the students of color in those buildings?
Yeah, 100%. So I know you have another critique that we wanted to talk about. So you want to introduce our next critique?
Yeah, which was just that, like, another thing that people have said is, like, moving teachers from Southwest schools to North or global majority schools might not actually be good for kids. And you have a great point about this.
So, my point around this is, like, I don't understand why we think it's okay to hire teachers who could teach in Lake Harriet that can't teach in City View, right? Like, I think that we have to have a real conversation around, like, what is the bar to teach in Minneapolis public schools? And why are we comfortable saying, oh, it's okay for that teacher to be at Burroughs, Lake Harriet, Armitage, but we have a lot of concerns if we're going to start moving them to Bethune, Hall, City View, Lind. And I think that's a real conversation that we have because what we're doing is we're saying, like, to your exact point that you just made, there are still students of color that go to schools, but actually they're much more vulnerable because they're more isolated. So they're much more easily ignored. They're much more easily targeted, like all these different things. And so to have a teacher that says, oh, you know what, like, or if we're saying we aren't comfortable with that teacher being in some of our schools that serve global majority student or communities, like that's we're still disserving, like it's a smaller number, but we're still underserving and disserving our students of color in some of those buildings. And so I think that is, a real concern, and, something that I know you and I have talked a lot about, and I know you've talked about more publicly recently, is, the teacher that came to school with a Trump mask on the anniversary of George Floyd's murder, right? Like, there's lots of debate going on, I know, internally about whether the teacher knew or not that this was the anniversary or whatever. Like, if you're teaching in Minneapolis public schools a year after everything that our city went through, and you're not aware of what, former President Trump represents to our community, and also what the sensitivity of that day, right? Like, I think, you probably not only shouldn't be able to teach in City View, you probably shouldn't teach anywhere in Minneapolis public schools, right? But
and by the way, is it good for white students to have a teacher that we know would racially identify and discipline black students? Is like I'm sorry, but like for the families who are at Lake Harriet, like, how are we gonna anti-racist your kids if you're gonna say like that teacher is not good for black kids, but I'll take it from my kid?
right, and so I think
That's not sharing the responsibility of undoing this thing. That's just like that we can't. That's not good for white kids either.
right, and so I think what we have to really look at is, like, what does a school community need, right?
Yes.
And so we're not necessarily saying let's move all of the teachers that have moved their way into southwest Minneapolis, let's move them to north. What we're saying is, like, how do we create more opportunities for schools, especially in north, to identify and choose the teachers that they need? Like, this is what it comes down to, right? Is like, we have to figure out a way to meet student needs. And right now we are so focused on allowing and, protecting teacher choice and preserving teacher jobs within Minneapolis that we're neglecting trying to figure out how do we meet student needs. And that may mean looking out, blowing up our current hiring system that preserves this value of, like, we have to protect our, predominantly white teaching force, when actually we need to figure out, how do we serve our kids of color? How do we serve our Indigenous students? How do we serve our low-income students? And that isn't to say that our current teaching force can't do that, right? But, like, what it is, or not every teacher in our teaching force can't do that, right? But what it is saying is, like, how do we identify the people who are best fit to do so? And what we're doing right now is we're limiting that pool to people who are only currently in Minneapolis public schools. And we're limiting it to, again, a predominantly white teaching force. And that has to change. And because we have to create more options, we have to give schools more flexibility, because the needs are great. Our students are brilliant and the needs are great. And we have to figure out a better way to support them. And right now we're not. And one of the big ways that we're just serving them is through our teacher movement and our teacher selection and our teacher accountability.
Yeah, which, I mean, I think wouldn't it be amazing right now if our principals could be out interviewing the young teachers of color who are graduating. They are not, and they cannot, and so we should talk about the fact that they are not out interviewing new opportunities, new teachers of color, young, right? We're not even to interview right now.
And why can't they interview?
Right now, principals are sitting in the placement process. So they are sitting and waiting for the phone to ring to let them know which teachers are going to be placed in their buildings. And then that appeals process has to finish, right? So if I'm a teacher and then I get placed there and then I don't want to be there, then I have to appeal. And when all of that is done, probably a month after all the other schools have other districts, Anoka Hennepin and Robbinsdale,
Yeah.
St. Paul, they're all hiring right now. We're not. We're
Yeah.
not.
And what they're waiting for, is the teachers who have been left over, who are not selected, who are not do not have jobs after the first two rounds of interviewing, right? And so they've gone through interview and select, where they could have made a mutual decision that they, a teacher and a principal could have made a mutual decision that that's the school for them for this next year. Then they went through matching, which is like a job fair where, they still couldn't find a fit. And so now, again, we have this value around stability. We have this value around, preserving, our current teaching jobs. And what we're not valuing is like, maybe there's a reason why this group of teachers aren't meeting the needs of students, and we're prohibiting our system from, recruiting more teachers of color to fill the needs that we have right now, to fill the vacancies. And by the way, that's again only happening in the places where there are vacancies, which is in North Minneapolis, right? Like predominantly in North Minneapolis, predominantly in schools that are serving students of color, students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, right? And so these, like, again, this, maybe this needs to be our new symbol, right? Like this movement, because this is how it's happening, right?
Yeah, and we talked to two Northside principals this week who have open positions, who can't do anything but wait for the phone to ring and find out who they get.
Who's being placed on them, who's being placed in their buildings.
Yep. And I will say also, I have had children who have had an experience of being in a classroom with a placed teacher. Yeah, I will just say that. All right. So then the next thing that we've been criticized for by the way, I think sometimes like criticizing, giving feedback, making sure our messaging is right. Like this is important to us. We want to make sure our language is accurate. So like we welcome these conversations in this.
Yeah.
Feedback, right?
Yeah. No, we're not addressing them to say like, no, you're wrong. We're addressing them to say, this is where we're at with it.
Yeah.
So,
and like we want to hear more. But like one of the things that someone asked is like, how do you define quality? Like, so how do you define, and so like, I think there's a lot of ways that we could define quality. I would like to see quality defined by teachers that manage to get a year's worth of growth out for students. To me, growth, and that's where we can kind of get into some of that testing and those conversations, which we don't have time for today, but we need to see teachers who are making a year's worth of growth in a school year's worth of time. And I think that we should be able to see that.
Right. Like a year's worth of growth should be the baseline for our teachers, right? Like, but again, right now our needs are great. And so we also need teachers, we need our superstar teachers to get more than a year's worth, like a year and a half worth of growth out of our students, right? And I know it's a lot. We're asking for a lot right now. And, still, we don't know when this pandemic is ending, but in the middle of a pandemic, right? And we know this year has been hard. So we're not saying this to pile on teachers. Like we know teachers have been doing a lot this year, but what we are saying is we understand what our student needs are as a system, right? And so how do we ensure that student growth is at the center of how we're supporting students, and also how we're defining what quality really looks like? But then I think, Heather, I interrupted you, so I didn't want to interrupt you in your list of things that matter for
it's okay.
Defining quality.
I think growth really matters, but I also think the thing that we don't talk about enough is the discipline disparities that are in our district, right? So if I'm a parent and I'm looking at like there's 3 teachers in this grade, to me as a parent of students of color, one of the most valuable things that I would want to know is, does this teacher get growth for students of color, and does this teacher have a discipline disparity rate for students of color? And to me, I think that would be another amazing way that we could define a quality teacher. But how would we do that with the system that we have right now?
Right. I think what is important, and what I'm hearing from you, is like just clear data, right? Like we need to be able to evaluate and have those evaluations mean something for how we're holding teachers accountable, and how we're able to now then define like, yeah, here are the teachers that can meet the needs of our school communities, right? And so not only do I think, that how do we define and evaluate quality needs to look at growth data, needs to look at discipline data. I think it needs to look at parent feedback. I think it needs to look at student feedback. And these are things that we know that other folks and stakeholders think is important too, right? And so But
Hmm.
what is important is we need to have a meaningful conversation around what does evaluation look like,
Yes.
so that we can then understand who our teachers are and start making, decisions around what schools they need to be in or should be in based on that information and data. But right now we aren't making decisions in that way. And so we're making decisions again in a system that over commits to teacher choice and under commits to student need. And so we see again this thing, right? Like we say this thing now is a joking way, but really this is the historical racialized patterns of our city and our deeply racist city. And I need us to hear that on the day that they just opened up George Floyd Square. We have historical patterns that are deeply, deeply racist. And the movement, the way that our teachers move around the city replicates and is emblematic of that pattern. And we have an opportunity to disrupt that. And we have to hold our district accountable to having those conversations. We have to have our board accountable to pushing our districts to make those changes. And we have to hold our union accountable to saying, we want you to commit. When we talk about racial justice, we want you to commit to disrupting what is within your power to disrupt. And that's what we need to see. And we know that both sides are working on trying to recruit and retain teachers of color, but we also need to figure out how are we changing our teacher movement patterns, because they're deeply, deeply racist.
Yeah, and I think, a part of the conversation that we often miss is when we talk about teachers and we talk about that, what we very rarely talk about is the incredible and amazing Black teaching force that was destroyed, like decimated, sucked up into white teachers, and so during integration, and that harm, that reparations, I'm not seeing enough thinking about students of color and what they've missed since that time, right? How many generations of kiddos have gone through K-12 since we destroyed something? And I would like to see us talk a little bit more about the reparations of that destruction. And I I'll share with you, my favorite book is The Lost Education of Horace Tate, and it's a story. It's a story about one man, right, and how he fought so hard to keep his Black schools and his Black teachers and just get a fraction of the slice of the. He never really wanted integration. In the end, though, his Black teachers union was absorbed, even their property, into the white teachers. And we saw that all across the country. And just because we are in the Midwest does not mean we didn't do that.
So I I really appreciate this conversation. I hope people have had their eyes open a little bit to why this issue is so important to us, our passion, our curiosity, our ferocity around this issue. And so, but I also want to deeply and sincerely thank everybody who's provided feedback and constructive criticism and insight to helping us get to this point around where we're at with our campaign. These are real issues. These criticisms, what we brought forward as an issue, and the criticisms and the feedback are all very, very real things that people have been open and vulnerable and sharing with, and have shaped totally shaped where we're at with this issue. And we want to continue to get there. And so I just want to thank everyone who's contributed to this, because I hope you all hear and see yourselves and how this is being shaped and where this conversation is going. And we want to continue to partner with y'all in this conversation. So with that being said, we have a couple of videos coming out next week with a couple of guests to help give us a little bit of a recent historical perspective on this issue. And so we're really excited for that. So check in next week to hear that. But thank you all for participating and listening in this conversation. Appreciate it.
Bye.